On a quiet morning in March 1998, a 10-year-old girl left her home in Vienna to walk to school. She never arrived. What followed was one of the most haunting kidnapping cases in modern history, a child hidden in a cellar, a nation desperate for answers, and a survival story that would shock the world. This is the story of Natascha Kampusch, 3,096 days in captivity, and the fight to reclaim her life. It was an ordinary Monday morning in Vienna, Austria. The air was crisp, and the streets of Austr8, a residential district on the eastern side of the city, were beginning to fill with people heading to work and children walking to school. In one of the modest apartment blocks, 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch prepared for her day. She was small for her age, with a bright, curious personality, sometimes shy but fiercely independent. That morning, like many others, she set off alone on the short walk to school. Her mother later described the moment as routine, a decision many parents made at that time. After all, the walk wasn't long. The streets felt safe. But in a matter of minutes, Natascha's world would change forever. As she made her way along the familiar path, a white van pulled up. A man stepped out. And in that instant, Natascha disappeared from public view. She was gone. It was a prosperous country, with Vienna consistently ranked as one of the most livable cities in the world. The nation was proud of its safety record. Crime existed, of course, but brutal acts of violence against children were considered rare, almost unthinkable. Families trusted their neighborhoods. Children often walked to school on their own. Communities were tightly knit. The very idea that a child could be abducted in broad daylight, in a residential area, seemed unimaginable. Yet, on that March morning, that sense of security cracked. What began as a single missing child case would grow into one of the most haunting and puzzling stories in modern European history. Across the world, countless children go missing every year. Many cases fade quickly from headlines. Some end in heartbreak. A few are solved with relief. But the story of Natascha Kampusch is different. Why? Because she was not missing for hours, or days, or even months. She was missing for 8 years. That's 3,096 days. And all that time, she was not far away. She was hidden in a small underground room, less than 20 kilometers from the city where she was taken. The horror of this case is not just the abduction itself. It is the fact that a child could be held in captivity for nearly a decade, while the world searched, speculated, and in many ways, gave up hope. The global shock. When the truth finally came out in 2006, the world was stunned. Headlines spread like wildfire. Kidnapped girl escapes after 8 years. The Austrian girl in the cellar. Europe's most famous missing child found alive. The media swarmed. Journalists rushed to Vienna. Psychologists, criminologists, and police analysts debated what had happened. The public was desperate for details. But beyond the sensational headlines was a human being. A young woman, then 18 years old, suddenly free but also suddenly exposed to the glare of global attention. Her return brought joy, disbelief, and also controversy. People wanted answers, not only about how she had been taken and hidden, but also about how she had survived, and what role her captor had played in shaping her life during those 8 long years. At the center of this case is not the criminal, not the police, not even the public fascination. At the center is Natascha herself. This is the story of her survival. What she endured during captivity defies imagination. For years, she lived in a hidden cellar, a space barely larger than a walk-in closet. She was isolated, controlled, punished, and yet somehow, she adapted. She found ways to hold on to fragments of normalcy, to maintain hope, to retain her sense of self. In her memoir, 3096 Days, Natascha later shared glimpses into her world. She wrote about routines, about small victories, about the complicated relationship with the man who abducted her. She described not only fear, but also resilience, the quiet determination that kept her alive. But the story of Natascha Kampusch has 2 dimensions. One is deeply personal, the hidden life of a girl in captivity, and the psychological strategies she used to survive. The other is public, the massive police investigation, the false leads, the rumors, and the mistakes that allowed her captor to remain undetected for nearly a decade. And when those 2 stories collided on August 23, 2006, the day she escaped, Austria was forced to confront difficult truths about its institutions, its media, and its treatment of survivors. This case is about more than one child and one criminal. It is about power, control, and the fragility of freedom. It is about the psychology of captivity, and the ways in which the human mind adapts to impossible circumstances. It is about the public's need for stories, sometimes oversimplified, sometimes sensationalized, and the toll that takes on real survivors. It is about the failures of systems designed to protect, and the questions of justice that remain unanswered. Above all, it is about survival. Natascha Kampusch was not born into a fairy tale life. But neither was hers a life marked by constant misery. Like many children in the modern world, she lived in a mixture of love and conflict, joy and hardship, independence and vulnerability. It was the combination of these factors, her family's circumstances, her personality, her routines, and the Austria she grew up in, that created the backdrop for one of the most haunting abductions in modern history. The Cold War had ended less than a decade earlier, and Europe was in a period of transition. Austria, long a neutral country, was proud of its stability. Vienna, its capital, was considered one of the safest and most orderly cities in the world. The crime rate was relatively low compared to other European capitals. Violent crime against children was particularly rare. Parents often allowed their children to walk to school or play in the streets unsupervised. The social fabric still carried an air of trust, a belief that nothing bad could happen here. In many ways, Austria in 1998 embodied the idea of security. Yet this very sense of safety would make the story of Natascha's disappearance all the more devastating. Because when something terrible happens in a place believed to be safe, it shakes not just one family, but an entire nation's sense of certainty. Natascha Kampusch was born on February 17, 1988. She was the youngest daughter of Brigitte Cerny and Ludwig Koch. Her early childhood was shaped by both love and conflict. Her parents' marriage was difficult. Arguments were frequent, tension often filled the household, and eventually, the relationship fractured. The divorce left scars that would linger in the family. Natascha primarily lived with her mother, Brigitte, but her father remained part of her life. Still, the separation was confusing and painful for a young child. Like many children of divorce, she often felt caught between two worlds, one with her mother, one with her father. Despite these struggles, Natascha's spirit was strong. She was described as imaginative, lively, and at times stubborn. She wanted to assert herself, to have a voice in her own life. This independence, though challenging for her parents, would later become one of her greatest survival tools. Brigitte, Natascha's mother, carried the burden of single parenting. She loved her daughter deeply, but their relationship was not without tension. Arguments were common, often over small things, what Natascha would wear, how she behaved, or her reluctance to follow instructions. These disagreements sometimes escalated, but they were the normal conflicts of a mother raising a strong-willed child. On the morning of the abduction, in fact, the two argued about something as simple as a hat. Brigitte wanted her daughter to wear it against the cold weather. Natascha refused. It was one of those trivial family moments that parents and children experience every day, the kind of moment that is forgotten within hours. But for Brigitte, that argument would become a source of unbearable guilt. Because it was the last exchange she had with her daughter before she disappeared. Natascha's father, Ludwig, was a quieter figure in her life. After the divorce, he lived apart, and contact was more limited. Yet Natascha cared for him deeply. He represented a different side of her family, one that she sometimes longed for, especially when conflicts at home with her mother became intense. This dynamic divided loyalties, shifting affections, and the longing for stability shaped her childhood. It also explains why Natascha sometimes craved independence. She wanted to be free of the push and pull between her parents. She wanted to prove that she could make her own choices. Even as a child, Natascha was described as intelligent, perceptive, and mature for her age. She asked questions that other children might not ask. She thought critically, sometimes even skeptically. But she was also sensitive. She felt emotions deeply. She could be shy with strangers, reluctant to open up. Yet with friends and trusted adults, she was expressive, creative, and sometimes even bold. Her stubborn streak was well known. Teachers noticed it. Family members saw it. If she disagreed with something, she would not simply obey without question. She wanted reasons. She wanted explanations. This trait, frustrating for adults at times, would later become a lifeline. Because stubbornness, in the right context, can be a form of resilience. Donaustadt, the district where Natascha lived, was the largest of Vienna's districts. It was a place of housing blocks, suburban-style neighborhoods, and stretches of open land. It was not glamorous, but it was ordinary, the kind of place where families lived, worked, and sent their children to school. The Kampusch home was modest. It was not wealthy, but it was stable. Natascha's school was within walking distance, and walking there each day was part of her routine. In Donaustadt, parents trusted their children to walk alone. It was seen as safe. The streets were familiar. Neighbors often looked out for one another. This was the environment in which Natascha grew up. And that daily walk to school, which symbolized her small independence, became the setting for her disappearance. When we picture Natascha in early 1998, we see a 10-year-old on the edge of adolescence. A girl navigating the complexities of divorced parents. A child asserting independence through small choices like walking to school alone. She was bright, stubborn, curious, and vulnerable all at once. And nothing about her life suggested what was about to happen. There were no warnings, no signs, no way to know that danger was waiting on the streets of Donaustadt. The story of Natascha's childhood is important because it reminds us she was not defined by her abduction. She was first a daughter, a student, a girl with dreams, fears, and everyday struggles. She was ordinary. And that ordinariness makes what happened next even more chilling. This was Natascha Kampusch's life in the winter of 1998. A modest home. A divided family. A spirited child trying to carve out her place in the world. A neighborhood that seemed safe, a routine that seemed normal. For most people in Vienna, it was just another day. Workers hurry to their jobs. Shops opened their doors. Children prepared for school. The city carried on with its routines, as it had every morning before. But for one family in the district of Donaustadt, it would be the day everything changed. 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch woke up for school. Her morning began like so many others, a little rushed, a little ordinary, and marked, as usual, by a few small disagreements with her mother. That morning, Natascha's mother, Brigitte, wanted her daughter to wear a hat. It was cold outside, and like many parents, she worried about her child catching a chill. But Natascha refused. She didn't like being told what to wear. She wanted independence, even in small choices. The argument was brief, but it left a sting. Brigitte insisted. Natascha protested. In the end, Natascha walked out the door without the hat. It was such a minor disagreement, the kind that happens between parents and children countless times each day. But for Brigitte, it would become a haunting memory because it was the last conversation she had with her daughter before she vanished. Natascha's school was only a short distance from her home, about 10 minutes on foot. She often walked alone, as many children in Vienna did at the time. The streets felt safe. The neighborhood was familiar. That morning, Natascha set off on her usual path. She wore her red jacket and carried her school bag. Witnesses would later recall seeing her walking along Rennbahnweg, a street in her neighborhood. To anyone passing by, it was an ordinary sight, a schoolgirl on her way to class. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. But as she continued her walk, a white van approached. The van was driven by a man named Wolfgang Pricklepil. He was 35 years old, an Austrian telecommunications technician, and someone who appeared, at least on the surface, to be unremarkable. But beneath that facade, Pricklepil harbored dark desires. For years, he had fantasized about abducting a young girl. He had prepared for this day with chilling precision, modifying his house, building a secret underground cell, and waiting for the moment to strike. On that morning, he spotted Natascha walking alone. To him, she was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He pulled the van alongside her. He stepped out. And within seconds, Natascha was forced inside. A neighbor would later claim to have seen part of the struggle, a small girl being pulled into a van. But in that moment, no one intervened. The van door slammed shut. The engine roared. And Natascha was gone. At home, Brigitte expected her daughter to arrive at school as usual. It was only later, when the school called to report that Natascha had never arrived, that panic began to rise. For any parent, this is the nightmare scenario: your child leaves home, but doesn't reach their destination. At first, you think it might be a mistake. Perhaps she's late. Perhaps she stopped at a friend's house. But as the minutes turn into hours, dread begins to take over. By the afternoon, Natascha was officially reported missing. The Austrian police were notified quickly. They launched a search in the local area, canvassing the neighborhood, questioning witnesses, and checking for any signs of the missing girl. One witness described seeing a white van in the area. Another recalled what looked like a child being forced inside. This should have been a crucial lead. But in the early hours of the investigation, there was confusion, miscommunication, and missed opportunities. The police, working with limited resources and relying on early witness accounts, did not immediately focus on Pricklepil's van. In fact, even though his vehicle was checked in later investigations, it was cleared too quickly. The significance of that early lead was lost. And as the hours turned into days, Natascha was already hidden away, invisible to the world. For Natascha, the experience inside the van was terrifying. She was just 10 years old, suddenly trapped, disoriented, and completely powerless. Pricklepil drove her away from the neighborhood, taking back roads to avoid attention. Natascha tried to scream, but he silenced her. She tried to fight, but she was too small. The journey was not long, less than half an hour, but for Natascha, it must have felt endless. With every passing minute, the familiar streets of her neighborhood disappeared behind her. She was leaving the safety of everything she knew. And when the van finally stopped, she found herself at the doorstep of the place that would become her prison for the next 8 years. The house was located in Strashow, a town just outside Vienna. From the outside, it looked ordinary, even dull, a modest home with nothing to attract suspicion. But beneath the house, Priklopil had built something extraordinary and sinister, a hidden cellar, carefully constructed and concealed. It was accessible only through a series of locked doors and secret mechanisms. This was where he intended to keep his victim. Natascha was dragged from the van, through the house, and into the hidden underground space. The door shut behind her. For the world above, she no longer existed. In the span of just a few hours, Natascha Kampusch's life had been stolen from her. What began as an ordinary school morning ended in abduction. Her mother was left with unanswered questions and unbearable guilt. The police were left scrambling for leads. And the man who had taken her retreated into the shadows with his captive. For Natascha, childhood ended that morning. In its place began 8 years of captivity, fear, and survival. When the door to the cellar closed behind her, Natascha Kampusch's childhood ended. She was only 10 years old, still small enough to cling to stuffed animals at night, still young enough to believe the world was basically safe. But that morning, March 2, 1998, the world collapsed into concrete, darkness, and silence. The space was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It wasn't a basement like the ones in ordinary houses. This was something deliberately engineered, a bunker-like cell, buried beneath the ground, soundproof, sealed off. It was the kind of place designed not just to hold a prisoner, but to erase a person from existence. To understand Natascha's captivity, we need to understand the mind of her kidnapper. Wolfgang Priklopil was not impulsive. He was not careless. He had spent years preparing for this crime. In the early 1990s, while still in his 20s, he began building modifications to his home in Strashow. Beneath the garage, he dug and reinforced a hidden chamber. The entrance was concealed behind a heavy cupboard, leading to multiple layers of security. First door, disguised and reinforced. Second door, thick concrete and steel. Third door, a trapdoor leading to the chamber itself. Each barrier was heavy, requiring strength to move. The entire system was designed to delay discovery and prevent escape. Inside, the chamber measured only about 5 square meters. A small, suffocating room with no windows, no natural light, and very little air circulation. The ceiling was low. The walls were bare concrete. For soundproofing, Priklopil had layered materials so that even screens would not penetrate. A radio was sometimes left on, not for her comfort, but to mask any accidental noise. This was the world Priklopil had been building, a prison for a child. For Natascha, those first hours were a blur of terror. One moment, she was walking to school. The next, she was in a place that didn't make sense, a narrow passage, a locked door, a suffocating cell. She was given no explanation. She didn't understand who this man was, or why he had taken her. At 10 years old, her mind could barely process the scale of what was happening. Her first instinct was to scream, to cry, to beg. And she did. But the thick walls swallowed her cries. Nobody could hear. Priklopil's reaction was cold. He did not comfort her. He did not explain. Instead, he issued orders. He made rules clear from the start. She was not to try to escape. She was to obey him. If she resisted, he would punish her. The child who only that morning had been arguing with her mother about a hat was now facing a captor who held absolute power. Night fell quickly in the cell, though night meant nothing inside. There was no sunlight, no clock, no way to measure time. For Natascha, that first night was terrifying. The darkness pressed in. The silence was unbearable. Her mind raced with questions. Would she ever go home again? Would her mother find her? Was she going to die here? The cell had a narrow bed, more like a hard surface with a blanket than anything comfortable. There was no window, no ventilation except a small system controlled by Priklopil. She had a bucket for a toilet. She curled up, crying herself to sleep. But even sleep offered little comfort. Every sound from above, every creak of the house, every heavy footstep made her heart race. She was alone, and utterly powerless. Wolfgang Priklopil was a man obsessed with control. He controlled the air she breathed, the light she saw, the food she ate. Every detail of her existence was determined by him. In those first days, he rationed her food, bread, water, small portions. Not enough to feel satisfied, but just enough to survive. He controlled when she could use the toilet. He controlled when she could hear a radio. And he reinforced, again and again, that he alone held her fate in his hands. For a child, the effect was devastating. Natascha realized very quickly that defiance was dangerous. That crying too loudly, or trying to resist, would only make things worse. To survive, she would have to learn his rules. Experts in child trauma described the first days of captivity as the most psychologically shattering. For Natascha, the shift was total. From freedom to confinement. From sunlight to artificial lamps. From the comfort of family to the constant presence of a captor. She was in shock. She could not process time. Hours stretched into eternities. Without windows, without clocks, her sense of day and night disappeared. This disorientation was deliberate. Priklopil wanted her to lose her sense of reality. To become dependent on him for every fragment of structure and meaning. The child who had once walked confidently to school was now reduced to waiting for scraps of food, a few minutes of light, or a rare word of conversation. While Natascha lay hidden underground, the world above was frantic. Her mother was desperately calling neighbors, friends, the school. Police were expanding their search, canvassing the area, and chasing leads. The community was plastering missing posters, hoping for any sign of the little girl. But no one suspected the house in Strashof. No one imagined that just beneath an ordinary garage lay a child's prison. For Natascha, there was no comfort in knowing that people were looking for her. She couldn't see it. She couldn't hear it. To her, the silence of the cell meant the world had already forgotten her. The cellar was more than a prison of concrete and steel. It was a prison of the mind. For Natascha, the first days set the stage for everything to come: the rules, the control, the isolation. For Priklopil, it was the realization of a plan he had nurtured for years. A plan that would keep her hidden, not for days, not for weeks, but for 8 long years. When the door to the cellar closed each night, Natascha was left with nothing but silence. No school bell to mark the hours. No sun to rise or set. No family voices in the next room. Only the sound of her own breathing in the stale, artificial air. Life in captivity was not dramatic in the way movies often show. It was not constant action. It was routine, monotony, repetition. It was waking up each day and realizing that nothing had changed, that the cell was still there, that her captor was still in control, and that freedom was no closer. This was her reality for 8 years. Over time, Priklopil imposed a structure. Each morning, he would come down to the cellar. Sometimes he brought food: bread, milk, fruit. Other times, barely anything at all. He controlled not just the quality, but the quantity. Some days she ate decently. Other days she went hungry. Her meals became a form of discipline. Food could be a reward. Or it could be withheld as punishment. He also controlled light. Natascha would often spend long stretches in darkness, with only the dim glow of a lamp when he chose to switch it on. Time blurred. She lost the natural rhythm of day and night. To keep her occupied, he gave her books. School books at first, later novels and magazines. Reading became her escape, a way to keep her mind active. Sometimes he allowed her to watch television, but always under his supervision. She was expected to keep the small cell tidy, to follow his instructions, and to obey without question. For a child, this routine became her new normal. But it was a normal defined entirely by someone else's control. When Natascha disobeyed, punishment followed. Sometimes, it meant being locked for days without light. Other times, being given only scraps of food. At times, it was verbal, harsh words, intimidation, the constant reminder that she was powerless. On some occasions, he hit her. On others, he threatened to kill her. One of the cruelest punishments was psychological. He told her that if she tried to escape, he would kill her and kill anyone who helped her. He made her believe that the world outside was not safe for her. That she was better off depending on him. This was not just imprisonment of the body, but of the mind. And yet, alongside cruelty, there were moments that seemed almost normal, at least on the surface. As years passed, Priklopil sometimes allowed Natascha into the upper parts of the house. She was not always locked underground. There were days when she cooked for him, cleaned his home, or even joined him for meals. Sometimes they watched TV together. At one point, he even let her use a phone under supervision. From the outside, these moments might look like kindness. But they were not. They were calculated manipulations. By granting small freedoms, then threatening to take them away, he kept her off balance. He blurred the lines between captor and companion, punishment and reward. This strategy deepened her dependency. She could not predict his moods. She could not trust when things seemed calm. Every small privilege was just another way of reinforcing control. How does a child survive such conditions? For Natascha, survival meant adaptation. She created small rituals to give herself structure. Reading at certain times. Doing exercises in the tiny space. Keeping her cell clean and organized. She imagined conversations with her family. She replayed memories in her head, holding on to them so they would not fade. As she grew older, she kept a kind of mental diary, rehearsing what she would one day tell people if she ever escaped. She found small victories where she could, holding on to her identity, refusing to let him completely erase her sense of self. But survival also meant compromise. She learned when to stay silent, when to obey, when to hide her emotions. It was a fragile balance, staying strong enough to endure, yet compliant enough to avoid punishment. Over time, something even more complex developed, a bond between captor and captive. Psychologists call it trauma bonding or, more popularly, Stockholm Syndrome. It doesn't mean affection in the normal sense. It means survival through dependency. Natascha was a child, growing into a teenager, with no one else to talk to, no other human contact. For 8 years, he was the only person in her world. At times, he could be cruel. At other times, he played the role of protector. He would talk to her, laugh with her, share meals. He told her lies about the outside world, making her believe she had nowhere else to go. And Natascha, needing human connection, responded the only way she could, by adapting to him, by not resisting too openly, by finding ways to coexist with the very man who had stolen her life. This bond would later confuse outsiders. Some would ask, why didn't she escape sooner? Why didn't she fight back? But the truth is, this bond was part of the prison. It was invisible, but just as powerful as the locked doors. Natascha entered the cellar at 10 years old, a child. She emerged at 18, a young woman. That transformation happened entirely under captivity. She celebrated birthdays alone. She experienced puberty in confinement. Every milestone of her teenage years, learning, changing, maturing, happened in a world defined by one man's control. For most children, growing up means independence, walking to school, making friends, choosing your path. For Natascha, growing up meant the opposite: dependence, restriction, the loss of freedom. And yet, somehow, she kept her mind alive. She kept imagining a future. She clung to the belief that one day, she would be free. For 8 years, this was life: the cell, the rules, the punishments, the strange bond. It was not a single event, but a long endurance test, day after day, year after year. And while the outside world moved on, forgetting her name, Natascha was fighting an invisible battle for survival. In the next chapter, we will see how cracks began to appear, how Priklopil's control weakened, how moments of opportunity began to open, and how, after 3,096 days in captivity, Natascha finally saw a chance to run. For 8 years, Natascha Kampusch had lived in a world of concrete and fear. Every day was the same: rules, punishments, silence. Every night, the door to the cellar closed like the ending of a sentence. But by 2006, something was beginning to shift. She was no longer a child. She was 18 years old, physically stronger, emotionally more mature, and no longer the small, terrified girl he had first abducted. And Wolfgang Priklopil, once in full control, was losing his grip. For years, Priklopil had been the absolute master of the situation. His routines, his punishments, his psychological control had kept Natascha trapped not only physically but mentally. But as the years passed, cracks began to appear. He became increasingly paranoid. He worried about being discovered, about neighbors noticing something, about Natascha escaping. His paranoia consumed him. At the same time, he had grown oddly dependent on Natascha. She cooked for him, cleaned his house, and in many ways, became part of his daily life. He trusted her more, even allowed her upstairs more often. But this trust was fragile. He still threatened her constantly. He still reminded her that if she tried to escape, he would kill her, or kill himself, or hurt others. This paradox, dependence mixed with paranoia, created instability. And instability can create opportunity. By 2006, Natascha was sometimes allowed outside, though always under his supervision. He made her help in the garden, do repairs, and assist with chores. For the first time in years, she could feel the sun on her skin. The air smelled different outside, fresher, sharper, alive. But these moments were bittersweet. Because she could not leave. The gates were locked, the walls high, and Priklopil always close by. Still, each time she stepped into the light, she was reminded the world was still there. This kept her hope alive. For months, Natascha began to think about escape. Not in fantasies, but in practical terms. She studied the routines. When did he leave the house? When was he distracted? Where were the doors unlocked? She also thought carefully about risk. If she tried to run and failed, he might kill her. If she shouted and nobody heard, she might be punished worse than ever before. She had to wait for the right moment, a window of opportunity small enough to slip through, but large enough to succeed. That moment came in August of 2006. It was an ordinary morning in Strashof. The summer sun was bright. Neighbors were out in their gardens. The world went about its business as usual. Inside the house, Priklopil assigned Natascha a task: to wash and vacuum his car. This was not unusual. She often helped with chores. But this time, something was different. He received a phone call. Work-related. Distracting. While he took the call, his attention shifted. The garden gate, usually locked, was left open. For 8 years, Natascha had been waiting for this. Heart-pounding, Natascha made her move. At first, she did not run. Running might draw attention. Running might make him notice too soon. Instead, she walked quickly, forcing herself to appear calm. Every step away from the house felt like a lifetime. She left the yard. She stepped out onto the street. The air was different here. She was outside the prison walls. But she was not safe yet. Her fear was overwhelming. What if he followed? What if he caught her? What if nobody believed her? She spotted a neighbor. Desperate, she approached, asking for help. At first, the neighbor thought she was just a confused teenager. But there was something in her eyes: urgency, terror. Finally, the words spilled out: "I am Natascha Kampusch. I was kidnapped. Please, help me." The neighbor called the police immediately. For the first time in 3,096 days, Natascha was free. The police arrived quickly. They took her statement, checked her identity, and confirmed the impossible: the missing girl from 1998 was alive. News began to spread within hours. Austria, and soon the entire world, was stunned. A girl kidnapped at 10 had survived 8 years in captivity, and now, at 18, she had escaped. While Natascha was being brought to safety, Wolfgang Priklopil realized what had happened. Overcome with panic, he fled. By the end of the day, he would take his own life, throwing himself in front of a train. His death meant that many questions would remain unanswered. But for Natascha, it meant that the man who had stolen her childhood could no longer touch her future. The escape of Natascha Kampusch was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There was no chase, no battle. It was quiet, cautious, almost ordinary. And yet, it was extraordinary. It was the culmination of years of patience, observation, and courage. A 10-year-old girl had been stolen. An 18-year-old young woman walked back into the world. When the call reached Austrian police on August 23, 2006, disbelief was the first reaction. The dispatcher heard the words, "I am Natascha Kampusch. I was kidnapped." It seemed impossible. For 8 years, her face had stared from missing posters. Her name had faded from headlines. The case had grown cold. Many assumed she was dead. And yet here she was alive, frightened, standing on a quiet street in Strashof. In that moment, Austria's greatest mystery began to unravel. The first officers to arrive were cautious. A teenage girl was claiming to be the missing child from 1998. They needed to confirm. They asked her name. She repeated it, Natascha Kampusch. They asked for details. She gave them her age, her mother's name, the school she had attended. Slowly, the officers realized the impossible was true. They brought her to the nearest police station, shielding her from public view. There, specialists began the process of verification. Fingerprints were taken. Old records were checked. Photographs compared. It was her. After 8 years, the missing girl had returned. From the police station, Natascha was taken to a hospital for examination. Doctors expected to find her weak, fragile, perhaps near death. But what they saw was different. Physically, she was pale and underweight, but not broken. She had been fed enough to survive, though her diet had been poor. Her skin was light from years without sunlight. Her hair was long and uncut. But what struck them most was her composure. Despite everything, she was alert, articulate, determined. She told doctors she had endured. She told them she had survived. By the evening, the news reached Austria's media. Headlines blazed across television. Natascha Kampusch found alive after 8 years. Reporters flooded Strashof. Satellite vans lined the streets. Neighbors were interviewed, shocked to learn that beneath an ordinary house, such a crime had been hidden. Around the world, the story spread within hours. CNN, BBC, and other outlets carried the headline. A missing child case, long assumed unsolved, had ended in survival. For Austria, it was a national earthquake. While Natascha was being examined, her captor was spiraling. Wolfgang Priklapil had realized she was gone. He knew the police would come for him. His carefully constructed secret was destroyed. He contacted a friend, confiding briefly that his world had collapsed. He seemed desperate, panicked. He knew there was no way back. That evening, he fled. He boarded a train. Witnesses later recalled a man, pale and silent, standing near the tracks. As the train approached, he jumped. Death came instantly. The man who had controlled Natascha's life for 8 years chose to end his own within hours of losing her. News of Priklapil's suicide only deepened the shock. Some felt relief, the monster was gone. Others felt anger, his death meant unanswered questions would die with him. For Natascha, it was complicated. She had lived with him for 8 years. He was her captor, her tormentor, but also, in a twisted way, the only human connection she had known. His sudden death left her conflicted. Meanwhile, the public and the media turned their attention entirely to her. Who was she now? What had she endured? How had she survived? The curiosity was overwhelming. Every journalist wanted her story. Every headline carried her name. Within days, the story of Natascha Kampusch dominated not only Austria, but the entire world. Press conferences were held. Experts speculated about her captivity. Neighbors gave interviews. Police defended their earlier investigations, criticized for failing to find her. And in the middle of it all was Natascha, just 18 years old, suddenly thrust into global spotlight. She asked for privacy. She wanted time to process her freedom. But the world would not look away. Her story had become more than survival. It had become a mirror forcing Austria to confront how such a crime could happen unnoticed, how a girl could vanish into a cellar while the world moved on above her. The aftermath of Natascha Kampusch's escape was not peace. It was chaos, questions, and relentless attention. She had survived her captivity. Now she had to survive freedom. In the next chapter, we will follow Natascha's struggle to rebuild her life, her reunions with family, her battle with the press, her attempts to find normalcy, and the long shadow her captivity continued to cast. When Natascha Kampusch escaped her cellar prison, many assumed her life would instantly become better. 8 years of captivity had ended. She was free. She was safe. She was alive. But freedom is not simple. Freedom can also be overwhelming. For Natascha, the outside world became a different kind of prison, one made of cameras, headlines, and endless questions. After her escape, Natascha was placed under police protection. She was taken to a secure location where she could rest and begin to process what had happened. Doctors and psychologists worked with her around the clock. They expected her to be broken, perhaps unable to function. But what they found surprised them. She was intelligent, articulate, and emotionally aware. She could describe her captivity in detail. She could explain how she had endured. Still, beneath that strength, there was fragility. The world outside was loud, bright, and overwhelming. Even something as simple as walking into a supermarket, seeing rows of food, felt alien after years of scarcity. One of the most emotional moments of those first days was Natascha's reunion with her mother, Brigitta. For years, Brigitta had lived with guilt. She had quarreled with Natascha the morning she disappeared. She had wondered if she could have done something differently. She had endured the pain of not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead. When they finally saw each other again, both were overwhelmed. Natascha was no longer the little girl her mother remembered. She was a young woman now. The years they had lost could never be returned. The reunion was tender, but also difficult. They had to learn each other again. Natascha's father, Ludwig, was also deeply affected by her return. During the years of her disappearance, her parents had separated, partly under the strain of grief and blame. When she was found, Ludwig wanted to reconnect. But Natascha's feelings were complicated. She had lived through so much without him. Their bond had weakened. Family reunions brought joy, but also tension. Everyone wanted to heal, but wounds of 8 years are not easily closed. Outside the safety of her recovery, the media storm raged. Every newspaper wanted an interview. Every television channel wanted her story. She was called the girl in the cellar, Austria's miracle, the lost child of Vienna. But Natascha resisted. She did not want to be reduced to a headline. She wanted to control her own narrative. Eventually, she agreed to give a carefully prepared statement. She thanked the public for their support but asked for privacy. She explained that healing would take time. Her words were calm, but reporters wanted more. They wanted the details, the cruelty, the abuse, the sensational. And when she refused to share, the press sometimes turned against her. They called her distant, cold, ungrateful. Freedom, she realized, came with a new captivity, the captivity of public judgment. The trauma of her captivity did not vanish overnight. Years in a small cellar had changed her physically and mentally. She struggled with normal interactions. Large crowds frightened her. Strangers overwhelmed her. There was also the shadow of Stockholm Syndrome, the controversial idea that victims can bond with their captors. Some observers claimed she showed sympathy for Wolfgang Pricklepil. They misinterpreted her nuanced feelings. The truth was more complex. She hated what he had done to her, but after 8 years, his presence had become part of her reality. His sudden death left her conflicted, not because she loved him, but because her identity had been shaped by surviving him. Psychologists explained, this was not sympathy. It was trauma. It was survival. Step by step, Natascha began to build a life in freedom. She learned to shop, to handle money, to walk the streets without fear. She reconnected with her education, catching up on years she had missed. She discovered new interests, new friendships. But always, she carried her past with her. The house where she had been held was demolished, but its memory lived inside her. Every interview, every news article brought it back. Yet Natascha refused to be defined only as a victim. She began to speak out, to take control of her story. Eventually, she wrote a memoir, describing her experience in her own words. Her message was clear: she was not the girl in the cellar. She was a survivor. Life after freedom was not simple. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was messy, complicated, filled with both healing and hurt. But Natascha Kampusch did not give up. She had survived captivity. And now, she was determined to survive freedom. In the next chapter, we will explore the controversies and conspiracy theories that surrounded her case, from accusations against the police, to questions about whether Pricklepil acted alone, to the endless debates that followed her every step. When Natascha Kampusch escaped in August 2006, Austria celebrated. The missing girl had survived. The nightmare was over. But celebrations did not last long. Very quickly, the miracle story began to unravel in the eyes of the public. Instead of being treated only as a survivor, Natascha became a subject of suspicion. People began asking questions. Why didn't she run earlier? Why didn't she cry on television? Why didn't she act like a victim is supposed to act? And in those questions, a new nightmare began, the nightmare of public judgment. In interviews, Natascha appeared calm, articulate, and at times even composed. She did not break down. She did not sob for the cameras. For many, this strength was inspiring. But for others, it was unsettling. Some thought she seemed too cold, too distant, or even too ungrateful. The press began writing headlines questioning her behavior. Commentators accused her of showing too much sympathy for her captor. Psychologists explained that her responses were normal for a trauma survivor. 8 years in captivity had forced her to adapt. She had learned to stay calm, to control her emotions, to protect herself. But the public was not ready for that explanation. They wanted a victim who fit the image in their minds. And Natascha, by simply being herself, broke that image. One of the biggest controversies surrounding her case was the idea of Stockholm Syndrome. The term, coined in the 1970s, describes when hostages develop emotional connections to their captors as a survival mechanism. It does not mean love or loyalty, it means adaptation under extreme stress. When Natascha expressed complicated feelings about Wolfgang Priklapil, suicide left her with mixed emotions. The press seized on it. They claimed she had fallen in love with him. Headlines. The reality was far more nuanced. She never excused what he had done. She never defended his crimes. But after 8 years of living in a closed world with only him, his sudden death left a void. That was not love. That was trauma. Still, the stigma of Stockholm Syndrome clung to her name. The police were also targeted. For 8 years, Natascha had lived in Strashov, in a house only a few kilometers from where she was abducted. Neighbors had reported suspicious things: construction noises, sealed windows, odd behavior. But the police had never searched thoroughly enough. After her escape, the Austrian public asked, how could they have missed her? The case files were reviewed. Mistakes were found. Leads had been ignored. Witnesses had not been followed up. Criticism mounted. Some believed that incompetence had allowed Priklapil to hide her in plain sight for nearly a decade. Beyond criticism, darker theories emerged. Some claimed that Priklapil had not acted alone. Rumors spread that he was part of a larger network, perhaps even connected to powerful figures. Others claimed that the police knew more than they admitted. Why had they closed the case so quickly after Priklapil's suicide? Why were certain files sealed? Still others accused Natascha herself of complicity, a cruel and unfounded theory suggesting she could have escaped earlier but chose not to. None of these theories were ever proven. Investigations confirmed that Priklopil acted alone. But the conspiracies refused to die. The controversy was fueled by the media. Television stations offered her money for interviews. Newspapers competed for exclusives. Some even invented stories when she refused to speak. Instead of being protected, Natascha often felt hunted. Reporters followed her in public. Paparazzi waited outside her home. Her private life became impossible to protect. Every gesture, every word was analyzed. If she smiled, she was accused of being too happy. If she stayed serious, she was accused of being cold. In captivity, her jailer had controlled her life. In freedom, it seemed the media wanted to do the same. Through it all, Natascha tried to maintain control of her story. She gave interviews on her own terms. She corrected false reports. She spoke openly about her trauma, not to satisfy curiosity, but to educate people about survival and resilience. Eventually, she published her memoir, 3096 Days, named after the number of days she spent in captivity. In it, she told the story in her own words, without distortion. Her message was clear: she was not a puppet for the media, not a passive victim, and not a conspiracy theory. She was a survivor, strong, independent, and unwilling to be silenced. The controversy and conspiracy that surrounded Natascha Kampusch's case showed something dark about society. We celebrate survivors, but only if they behave the way we expect. We demand their stories, but often twist them into something sensational. For Natascha, survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new struggle, to be believed, to be respected, and to be free from judgment. In the next chapter, we will explore how Natascha rebuilt her future, her career, her activism, and how she turned her pain into purpose. For 8 years, Natascha Kampusch had no choices. Her meals, her movements, her words, all were dictated by her captor. When she escaped, the world assumed her freedom would bring happiness. But freedom was not simple. It was heavy, complicated, and filled with new challenges. The question was, what would she do with her life now? Slowly, Natascha began to answer that question on her own terms. One of the first major steps Natascha took in reclaiming her identity was to write. In 2010, she released her memoir, 3096 Days. The title represented the exact number of days she had spent in captivity. The book was raw, detailed, and deeply personal. It described not only the events of her kidnapping and imprisonment, but also the psychological toll, the fear, the strategies she used to survive, the loneliness of being forgotten by the world. By writing, she did something powerful. She took back control of her own story. For years, newspapers and TV shows had speculated about her life. Now, in her own words, she told the truth. The book became an international bestseller. Readers were moved not just by the horror of her ordeal, but by her resilience and honesty. Her memoir later inspired a film, also titled 3096 Days, released in 2013. The movie brought her story to new audiences. It was difficult to watch, dark, claustrophobic, unflinching. But for many, it helped them understand the brutality of captivity and the strength it took to survive. For Natascha, the film was another step in shaping her legacy. By allowing her story to be told visually, she ensured it would not be forgotten. But it was not just about the past. Natascha wanted to use her voice to talk about the present, about victims, about resilience, and about the systems that fail children. As the years passed, Natascha grew into a role she had not chosen, but one she accepted, that of an activist. She began speaking publicly about the rights of children, about child safety, and about the importance of listening to victims. She criticized how society often judges survivors rather than supporting them. She reminded the public that trauma does not disappear when the prison door opens. Her advocacy was not always easy. The media still followed her, still twisted her words, still sought to sensationalize. But Natascha stayed firm. She wanted her suffering to mean something beyond herself. Her message was clear: survival should lead to change. Beyond the public eye, Natascha worked on building a private life, something most people take for granted. She explored education, studied, and developed her interests. She became fluent in multiple languages, read widely, and found a love for art and culture. She also faced the normal challenges of adulthood: friendships, trust, relationships. For someone whose teenage years had been stolen, these were new and sometimes difficult experiences. But step by step, she learned. Each small act of normal life, cooking for herself, traveling, walking freely through a city, was a victory. Even as she built her future, the past never fully disappeared. She continued to face criticism from some corners of the public. Conspiracy theories still circulated. Journalists still asked intrusive questions. At times, she admitted to struggling with loneliness, with the difficulty of trusting people, with the lasting scars of trauma. But she refused to let her past define her entirely. Instead, she turned it into strength. She showed that it is possible to survive horror and still create meaning, still create beauty, still move forward. Today, Natascha Kampusch stands not just as a survivor, but as a symbol. Her name represents both tragedy and resilience. Her story warns of the dangers of neglect and failure in society. But it also shows the human capacity to endure and overcome. Her book continues to be read worldwide. Her film continues to spark conversation. Her activism continues to push for awareness and protection for children. The girl who spent 3096 days in a cellar grew into a woman who chose not to let those days define the rest of her life. That is her legacy, not just survival, but transformation. In telling her story, in speaking out, in rebuilding her life, Natascha Kampusch reminds us of a profound truth. Evil can take years from a life, but it cannot erase the will to keep living. Her story is not just about captivity. It is about freedom, resilience, and the courage to claim one's future. In the final chapter, we will reflect on what her story means for us today, what lessons we can learn, and why it remains one of the most haunting and inspiring true crime cases of our time. The story of Natascha Kampusch is often told in headlines. Girl kidnapped in Vienna. Held captive for 3,096 days. Escaped at 18. But headlines are short. Headlines strip away the human being behind the story. To truly understand, we must go deeper, not only into what happened, but into what it means. Because Natascha's story is not just about crime. It is about survival, society, and the way we treat victims of trauma. Natascha was 10 years old when she was taken. She was walking to school in a quiet Austrian neighborhood. It was broad daylight. Her abduction was proof of a harsh truth: safety is fragile. Danger can come even in familiar places. It forced Austria and the world to face uncomfortable questions. How do we protect children? How do we respond when one goes missing? The police made mistakes. Leads were missed. Houses near the abduction site were not fully searched. For 8 years, a girl was hidden in plain sight. The first lesson is this: society must take missing children seriously, must search thoroughly, and must never assume too quickly. When people hear of long-term captivity, they often imagine two extremes: a broken victim or a dramatic, heroic escape. Natascha's reality was neither. She was not broken. She was resilient, resourceful, strategic. She found ways to endure. But her escape was not Hollywood. It was quiet, cautious, and filled with fear. The public wanted her to cry, to collapse, to behave like a movie character. When she didn't, they doubted her. This reveals another lesson: survivors don't fit into neat boxes. Trauma affects people in different ways. We must not judge survivors for how they respond. From the moment she escaped, Natascha was thrust into the glare of media. At first, the coverage was sympathetic. She was Austria's miracle. But soon, the tone shifted. Reporters demanded more details. When she refused, they criticized her. When she showed strength, they called her cold. When she admitted conflicted feelings, they called it Stockholm Syndrome. The media turned a victim into a spectacle. Here lies another lesson: the press can inform, but it can also exploit. Survivors deserve dignity, not sensationalism. Natascha's story also teaches us about trauma itself. Trauma is not just about the event. It is about the aftermath, the flashbacks, the mistrust, the difficulty in building relationships, the constant weight of memory. When she said she felt conflicted about Priklopil's suicide, many misunderstood. But psychologists explained, this was not affection. It was the complexity of trauma. When you spend 8 years with one person, even an abuser, their sudden absence creates shock. The lesson is clear: trauma is complex, survivors need space, and healing is not linear. Perhaps the most uncomfortable reflection is this: society failed Natascha twice. The first failure was when she was abducted and not found for 8 years, despite living so close. The second failure was after her escape, when instead of unconditional support, she faced judgment, gossip, and conspiracy theories. This shows a painful truth: we must do better, not only in protecting children, but also in supporting survivors when they return. Despite all of this, the captivity, the loss of childhood, the media storm, the criticism, Natascha chose to stand strong. She built a life. She told her story. She used her experience to advocate for others. Her resilience is a lesson in itself, that survival is possible, even after the darkest suffering. That a stolen childhood does not mean a stolen future. That strength is not about dramatic gestures, but about continuing each day, refusing to give up. When we look at Natascha's story, we can take away universal lessons. For families, always listen to children, always take their fears seriously. For police, never assume, never cut corners, because one missed detail can mean years of suffering. For society, judge less, support more. Survivors owe us nothing. For the media, people are not entertainment. Survivors are human beings, not headlines. For each of us personally, human resilience is greater than we imagine. In March 1998, a 10-year-old girl vanished on her way to school. In August 2006, an 18-year-old woman walked back into the world. Between those 2 points were 3,096 days of fear, survival, and endurance. But her story does not end with captivity. It does not even end with escape. It continues with rebuilding, with advocacy, with legacy. The final lesson of Natascha Kampusch's story is this: evil can steal years, but it cannot erase hope. Natascha's story is a painful reminder that safety can be fragile, even in the most ordinary moments. As parents and caregivers, we cannot protect children from every danger, but we can prepare them. Listen to them, believe them, and teach them to trust their instincts. Pay attention to their routines, their fears, and the people around them. Most importantly, give them the confidence to speak out, because sometimes a single warning, a single detail, can change everything. Let us honor Natascha's survival by making sure no child ever feels unseen, unheard, or unprotected. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to support the channel. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thumbs up, keep liking and sharing the videos you enjoy, it helps us reach more viewers. Stay tuned, because more powerful and inspiring true crime stories are just one click away. Thank you for watching. Folded hands.